Hi guys, before we start chapter number 7, let's recall what we learned in chapter number 6. So we learned about the Rajas, and the Rajas were chosen by Jana, that is the people. But around 300 years ago, we find some changes taking place in the ways in which Rajas were chosen. And some men now became recognized as Rajas by performing very big sacrifices like Ashwamedha or horse sacrifice. Then the ordinary people, the Vish or Vaishya, also brought gifts for the king. Some people, such as those who were regarded as Sudras by the priest, were excluded from many rituals. Now let's come to the Varnas. In the earlier chapter, we learned about Rig Vedic. Now we are going to learn about the later Vedic, that is the Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharva Veda. These were composed by priests and described how rituals were to be performed. They also contained rules about society. So there are 4 varnas or 4 groups of people. The first one are the Brahmins, second one are the rulers, third one Vaishyas, which include farmers, herders, and traders. And both the Kshatriyas and Vaishyas could perform sacrifices. And the last Varna is Shudras, who had to serve the other 3 groups and could not perform any rituals. Women were also grouped with the Sudras, so women and Sudras were not allowed to study the Vedas. And these Vedas were decided on the basis of birth. And there are people who are untouchables also. These include some craftspersons, hunters and gatherers, as well as people who helped perform burials and cremations. The priest said that contact with these groups were polluting. Janapadas. The Rajas who performed these big sacrifices like Ashwamedha were now recognized as being Rajas or Janapad, as rather than Janas. So Janapada, it literally means the land where the Jana set its foot and settled down. And this Janapad, in this Janapadas, so they lived in huts and they kept cattle as well as other animals, and they also grew a variety of crops like rice, wheat, barley, pulses, sugarcane, sesame and mustard. And they also made earthen pots. These were grey in color, others were red, and they also had painted greyware. Mahajanapadas. About 2500 years ago, some Janapadas became more important than others, and they are called Mahajanapadas. Most Mahajanapadas had a capital city. Many of these were fortified. Forts were probably built because people were afraid of attacks from other kings and needed protection, or to show how rich and powerful they were by building really large, tall, and impressive walls around their cities, or the land and people living inside the fortified area could be controlled more easily by the king. The new Rajas now began maintaining armies. Soldiers were paid regular salaries and maintained by the king throughout the year. Some payments were probably made using punch-marked coins. So let's come to taxes. As the rulers of the Mahajanapadas were building huge forts and maintaining big armies, they needed more resources and they needed officials to collect these. and they can no longer depend on this occasional gift brought by people. They want regular income type they needed so that they can build huge forts and maintain big armies. So what did they do? Taxes on crops were the most important. This was because most people were farmers. The tax was fixed at 1 by 6th of what was produced. This was known as bhaga or a share. There were taxes on craftspersons as well. These could have been in the form of labor. A weaver or a smith may have had to work for a day every month for the king. Herders were also expected to pay taxes in the form of animals and animal produce. There were also taxes on goods that were bought and sold through trade. And hunters and gatherers also had to provide forest produce to the Raja. Now let's see changes in the agriculture. One was the growing use of iron plowshare, and the second one is that people began transplanting paddy. And this transplantation of paddy, it is back-breaking work, and these are done by slave men and women and landless agricultural laborers, which are called kamakaras. So Magadha became the most important Mahajanapada in about 200 years, and in Magadha many rivers flows like Ganga and Son, and this is important for transport, water supplies, and making the land fertile. And there were elephants also in the forest, and they were used in the army. And from the forest, they got wood for building houses, carts, and chariots. And they also had iron ore mines, and they were used for tools and weapons. So Magadha has two very powerful ruler. The first one is Bimbisara, next is Ajatasattu. Mahapadmananda was another important ruler. He extended his control up to the northwest part of the subcontinent. Raja Griha, that is present day Rajgir in Bihar, was the capital of Magadha for several years, and later the capital was shifted to Patliputra, present day Patna. More than 2300 years ago, a ruler named Alexander, who lived in Macedonia in Europe, wanted to become a world conqueror. And he conquered parts of Egypt and West Asia, and he came to India and reaching to the banks of the Bias. But his soldier later refused to march forward, march further to the east. Because they were scared as they heard that the rulers of India had vast armies of foot soldiers, chariots, and elephants. Let's come to Vaji, which is also a Mahajanapada. So, Vaji is a powerful kingdom, and its capital is at Vaishali. Bihar was under a different form of government known as Gana or Sangha. Gana is used for a group that has many members, and Sangha means organization or association. So, Gana or a Sangha, there were not one but many rulers. Sometimes, even when thousands of men ruled together, each one was known as the Raja. These Rajas performed rituals together. They also met in assemblies and decided what had to be done and how through discussion and debate. For example, if they were attacked by an enemy, they met to discuss what should be done to meet the threat. However, women, dasas, and kamakaras could not participate in these assemblies. Both the Buddha and Mahavira belonged to Ganas or Sanghas. So some account of Vajis were taken from Digha Nikaya in famous Buddhist book, which contains some of the speeches of the Buddha. These were written down about 2300 years ago. So the Buddha asked whether the Vajis met frequently in full assemblies. When he heard that they did, he replied that the Vajis would continue to prosper as long as they held full and frequent public assemblies. They met and acted together. They followed established rules. They respected, supported, and listened to elders. Vaji women were not held by force or captured. Chaityas, that is, local shrines, were maintained in both towns and villages. Wise saints who followed different beliefs were respected and allowed to enter and leave the country freely. Next will come the Gupta rulers. So this democracy is a form of government which was made for the first time in Greece, and it lasted for about 200 years, and all free men over the age of 30 were recognized as full citizens. There was an assembly that met at least 40 times a year to decide on important matters, and women were not considered citizens. So that's all. And now let's come to chapter number 7. So, chapter number 7, new questions and ideas. Anagha. Okay, Anagha's school trip. This was the first time Anagha was going on a school trip. They boarded the train from Pune in Maharashtra late at night to go all the way to Varanasi in Uttar Pradesh. Her mother, who came to see her off at the station, told the teacher, "Do tell the children about the Buddha and take them to see Sarnath as well." The story of the Buddha. Siddhartha, also known as Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, was born about 2500 years ago. This was a time of rapid change in the lives of people, as you saw in chapter 6. Some kings in the Mahajanapadas were growing more powerful, new cities were developing, and life was changing in the villages as well. Many thinkers were trying to understand these changes in society. They also wanted to try and find out the true meaning of life. The Buddha belonged to a small Gana known as Sakya Gana and was a Kshatriya. When he was a young man, he left the comforts of his home in search of knowledge. He wandered for several years, meeting and holding discussions with other thinkers. He finally decided to find his own path to realization and meditated for days on end under a peepal tree. On peepal tree, under a peepal tree at Bodh Gaya in Bihar, where he attained enlightenment. After that, he was known as Buddha, or the Wise One. He then went to Sarnath, near Varanasi, where he taught for the first time. He spent the rest of his life traveling on foot, going from place to place, teaching people till he passed away at Kushinara. The Buddha taught that life is full of sufferings and unhappiness. This is caused because we have cravings and desires which often cannot be fulfilled. Sometimes, even if we get what we want, we are not satisfied and want even more or want other things. The Buddha described this as thirst or tanha. He taught that these constant cravings could be removed by following moderation in everything. The stupa. Okay, so this structure. This is the stupa at Sarnath. This building, known as a stupa, was built to mark the place where the Buddha first taught his message. You will learn more about stupas in chapter 12. He also taught people to be kind and to respect the lives of others, including animals. He believed that the results of our action, called karmas, whether good or bad, affect us both in this life and the next. The Buddha taught in the language of the ordinary people, Prakrit, so that everybody could understand his message. He also encouraged people to think for themselves rather than to simply accept what he said. Let us see how he did this. The story of Kisagotami. Here is a famous story about the Buddha. Once there was a woman named Kisagotami whose son had died. She was so sad that she roamed through the streets of the city carrying the child with her, asking for help to bring him back to life. A kind man took her to the Buddha. The Buddha said, "Bring me a handful of mustard seeds, and I will bring your child back to life." Kisagotami was overjoyed and started off at once, but the Buddha gently stopped her and said, "The seeds must come from the house of a family where nobody has died." Kisagotami went from door to door, but wherever she went, she found out that someone or the other, father, mother, sister, brother, husband, wife, child, uncle, aunt, grandfather, grandmother had died. That was what was the Buddha trying to teach the sorrow? What was the Buddha trying to teach the sorrowing mother? Now let's come to Upanishads. Around the time that the Buddha was preaching, and perhaps a little earlier, other thinkers also tried to find answers to difficult questions. Some of them wanted to know about life after death. Others wanted to know why sacrifices should be performed. Many of these thinkers felt that there was something permanent in the universe that would last even after death. They described this as the Atma. Many of the thinkers felt that there was something permanent in the universe that would last even after death. They described this as the Atma, or the individual soul, and the Brahma, or the universal soul. They believed that ultimately both the Atma and the Brahma were one. Many of their ideas were recorded in the Upanishads. These were part of the later Vedic text. Upanishads literally means approaching and sitting near, and the text contains conversations between teachers and students. Often ideas were presented through simple dialogues. So, Upanishads, it literally means approaching and sitting near, and the text contains conversations between teachers and students. Often ideas were presented through simple dialogues. The Wise Beggar. Here is a dialogue based on a story from one of the most famous Upanishads, the Chandogya Upanishad. Shonaka and Abhiprataran were two sages who worshipped the universal soul. Once, as they sat down to eat, a beggar came and asked for some food. "We cannot spare anything for you," Shonaka said. "Learned sirs, whom do you worship?" the beggar asked. "The universal soul," Abhipratarin replied. "Ah, it means that you know that the universal soul fills the entire world." "Yes, yes, we know that," the sages nodded. "If the universal soul fills the whole world, it fills me too. Who am I but a part of the world?" the beggar asked. "You speak the truth, O young Brahmin." "Then, O sages, why not giving me food?" Okay. Then, O sages, by not giving me food, you are actually denying food to the universal soul. The sages realized the truth of what the beggar said and shared their food with him. How did the beggar convince the sages to share their food with him? Most Upanishadic thinkers were men. Especially Brahmins and Rajas. Occasionally there is mention of women thinkers, such as Gargi, who was famous for her learning and participated in debates held in royal courts. Poor people rarely took part in these discussions. One famous exception was Satyakama Jabala, who was named after his mother, the slave woman Jabali. He had a deep desire to learn about reality, was accepted as a student by a Brahmin teacher named Gautama, and became one of the best known thinkers of the time. Many of the ideas of the Upanishads were later developed by the famous thinker Shankaracharya, about whom you will read in class 7. Panini D Grammarian. This was also the time when other scholars were at work. One of the most famous was Panini, who prepared a grammar for Sanskrit. He arranged the vowels and the consonants in a special order and then used these to create formulas like those found in algebra. He used this to write down the rules of languages in short formulae, around 3000 of them. It's a very huge number, 3000. Now let's come to Jainism. Now let's see Jainism. The most famous thinker of the Jains, Vardhaman Mahavira. also spread his message around this time, that is 2500 years ago. He was a Kshatriya prince of the Lachavi, a group that was part of the Vaji Sangh, about which you read in chapter 6. At the age of 30, he left home and went to live in a forest. For 12 years he led a hard and lonely life, at the end of which he attained enlightenment. He taught a simple doctrine: men and men okay men and women who wished to know the truth must leave their homes. They must follow very strictly the rules of ahimsa, which means not hurting or killing living beings. All beings, said Mahavira, long to live. To all things life is dear. Ordinary people could understand the teachings of Mahavira and his followers because they used Prakrit. So Buddha also used Prakrit and Mahavira also used Prakrit. There were several forms of Prakrit used in different parts of the country and named after the reasons in which they were used. For example, the Prakrit spoken in Magadha was known as Magadhi. Followers of Mahavira, who were known as Jainas, had to lead very simple lives, begging for food. They had to be absolutely honest and were specially asked not to steal. Also, they had to observe celibacy. And men had to give up everything, including their clothes. Jaina. The word Jaina comes from the term Jina, meaning conqueror. Why do you think the term Jina was used for Mahavira? It was very difficult for most men and women to follow these strict rules. Nevertheless, thousands left their homes to learn and teach this new way of life. Many more remained behind and supported those who became monks and nuns, providing them with food. Jainism was supported mainly by traders. Farmers who had to kill insects to protect their crops found it more difficult to follow the rules. Over hundreds of years, Jainism spread to different parts of North India and to Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka. The teachings of Mahavira and his followers were transmitted orally for several centuries. They were written down in the form in which they are presently available at a place called Valavi in Gujarat about 1500 years ago. The Sangh. Both the Mahavira and Buddha felt that only those who left their homes could gain true knowledge. They arranged for them to stay together in the Sangh, and association for those who left their homes. The rulers made for the Buddhist the rules made for the Buddhist Sangh were written down in the book called the Vinaya Pitaka. This is the rule book. From this we know that there were separate branches for men and women. All men could join the Sangh. However, children had to take the permission of their parents and slaves that of their masters. Those who worked for the king had to take his permission and debtors that of creditors. Women had to take their husbands' permission. Men and women who joined the Sangh led simple lives. They meditated for most of the time and went to cities and villages to beg for food during fixed hours. That is why they were known as bhikkhus, the Prakrit word for beggar. Bhikkhus, the Prakrit word for beggar, and bhikkhunis for women. They taught others and helped one another. They also held meetings to settle any quarrels that took place within the Sangh. Those who joined the Sangh included Brahmins, Kshatriyas, merchants, laborers, barbers, courtesans, and slaves. Many of them wrote down the teachings of the Buddha. Some of them also composed beautiful poems, described their life in the Sangh. List at least two ways in which the Sangh described in this lesson was different from the one mentioned in chapter 6. Were there any similarities? So this picture is a cave hollowed out in the hills. This is a cave in Karli, present-day Maharashtra. Monks and nuns lived and meditated in these shelters. Now let's talk about monasteries. To begin with, both Jains and Buddhist monks went from place to place throughout the year. The only time they stayed in one place was during the rainy season, when it was very difficult to travel. Then their supporters built temporary shelters for them in the gardens, or they lived in natural caves in hilly areas. As time went on, many supporters of the monks and nuns, and they themselves, felt the need for more permanent shelters or monasteries were built. For more permanent shelters, and so monasteries were built. These were known as Viharas. The earliest Viharas were made of wood and then of brick. Some were even in caves that were dug out in hills, especially in western India. A Buddhist text tells us, just as the waters of rivers lose their names and separateness when they flow into the mighty ocean, so are varna and ranks and family forgotten when the followers of the Buddha join the order of monks. So there are no varna system inside the monasteries. Very often the land on which the vihara was built was donated was donated by a rich merchant or a landowner or the king. The local people came with gifts of food, clothing, medicine for the monks and nuns. In return, they taught the people. Over the centuries, Buddhism spread to many parts of the subcontinent and beyond. You will learn more about this in chapter 10. The systems of ashramas. Around the time when Jainism and Buddhism were becoming popular, Brahmins developed the system of ashramas. Here the word ashram here the word ashram does not mean a place where people live and meditate. It is used instead for a stage of life. 4 ashrams were recognized: Brahmacharya, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, and Samyasa. Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Vaishya men were expected to lead. So Brahmin, Kshatriya, and Vaishya men were expected to lead simple lives and study the Vedas during the early years of their life. That is Brahmacharya. So the first one, Brahmacharya. Next, Grihastha, Vanaprastha, then Samyasins. So then they had to marry and live as households, Grihastha. Then they had to live in the forest and meditate, Vanaprastha. Finally, they had to give up everything and become Samyasins. The system of ashramas allowed men to spend some part of their lives in meditation. Generally, women were not allowed to study the Vedas and they had to follow the ashram chosen by their husbands. In what way was the system of ashram different from life in the Sangha? What are the varnas mentioned here? Were all 4 varnas allowed to participate in the system of ashram? Elsewhere in the world. Find Iran in your atlas. Zoroaster was an Iranian prophet. So, Zoroaster was an Iranian prophet. His teachings are contained in a book called the Avesta. The language of the Avesta and the practices described in it are very similar to those of the Vedas. The basic teachings of Zoroaster are contained in the maxim: good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Here is a verse from the Jain Avesta. Lord, grant strength and the rule of truth and good thinking, by means of which one shall create peace and tranquility. For more than 1,000 years, Zoroastrianism was a major religion in Iran. Later, some Zoroastrians migrated from Iran and settled down in the coastal towns of Gujarat and Maharashtra. They were the ancestors of today's Parsis. And settled down in the towns of Gujarat and Maharashtra, and they are the ancestors of today's Parsis. So Parsis they follow Zoroastrianism. Imagine you want to go to listen to one of the preachers who lived about 2500 years ago. Describe your conversation with your parents as you try to persuade them to let you go. Keywords: Tanha, Prakrit, Upanishad, Atma, Brahma, Ahimsa, Jaina, Sangh, Bhikshu, Vihara, monastery, ashrama. Now let's see the true or false. Number A. The Buddha encouraged animal sacrifices. It would be false. Sarnath is important because it was the place where the Buddha taught for the first time. It's true. The Buddha taught that karma has no effect on our lives. It's false. The Buddha attained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya. It's true. Upanishadic thinkers believe that the Atma and Brahma were ultimately one. It's true. Now let's see some important dates. Upanishadic thinkers, the Jaina teacher Mahavira and the Buddha, this happened about 2500 years ago. Writing down of the Jaina's text about 1500 years ago. That's all guys. Thank you and see you in my next video. Bye guys.